Story that I want to tell is about Wedge Island, but it may have implications beyond islands. So the reason we went out to that island was ultimately because of an introduction of 6 wombats in 1970. And now the wombats were digging up heritage buildings and causing a havoc on the island, as in so many other areas. So we went out there and saw that wombat numbers had substantially increased. So that's our observation. 700 burrows, taking some ballpark conversion factors means about 300 wombats, maybe 100, maybe 500, but anyway, it's a lot. And it's also shown, if we look at the reports back, it's pretty much an uncontrolled growth, as you would probably expect if you let out any mammal and some unlimited resource. So, but what we also found is that the wombat burrows were actually, we found more rock wallabies than wombats in that area. So that actually pretty much early on made us take some data, and we looked at tracks of rock wallabies and bettongs, another endangered species that they reintroduced in the 80s onto the island at the wombat burrows. Because what we know is that wombats are ecosystem engineers, and as such, they are probably an extremely important part of arid ecosystems. So here was a possibility to study that. Here's the rock wallabies. What we also found is a landscape patterning that you probably wouldn't expect without any human influence or any gardening, I can say, because that island was abandoned, the grazing was abandoned, and you would expect some more homogeneous shrubs in the area. So let's have a look at some numbers, some data. This is the map that we created, so we traversed the entire island and GPSed individual wombat burrows, capturing probably about 90% of all the area that we could actually see. Pattern are non-random, so that actually corresponds to something we also found in the Marylands, that if you have burrowing animals in the landscape, they only occupy, or wombats in particular, they only occupy a small proportion of the land. So here is our somehow just a rough classification of density, and that's the homestead, so right in the area where they probably like to burrow. Clear, I mean, that's deep soils, protected, a good area to build a home and garden. What we also found, and that's the interesting story now, is that at about 40% of all wombat burrows, we found tracks of rock wallaby, and about 12% tracks of bettongs. So, a clear indication of co-use and of wombat burrows as an important landscape resource. So that was the first study, and that's just come out in Australian Mammalogy right now. It's available online. But what we also found is, this is a picture of an air photo that we took later about the pattern of this open landscape that may be created by this interplay of wombats, allowing rock wallabies to be away from cliffs, more in the inland areas because they're using it intensively, and rock wallabies as browsers, keeping the shrubs out and maintaining a grassland. So here we have a combination of a ecosystem engineer and a gardener creating a landscape mosaic. Isn't that something? So some more data, and that's now Liz Thornett's honors thesis. We put out 50 cameras to look at the activity, and came back after a few months with 330,000 photos that we analyzed. Now we only looked at 105,000 and recorded about 10,000 instances of animal activity, and so a few bar graphs now for those of you who are now. First, a few pictures. So, wombats, rock wallabies, bettongs, penguins, and a few more birds that I just skipped through. I don't think this guy actually went into the burrow, but anyway, I show the pictures. I'll come back to the juvenile sea eagle at the end if I have time. So anyway, back to the boring stuff. The number of species that we found was a total number of 21 species using burrows as indicated by movement of grass or changes in tracks before and after we saw a picture of the animal. There's a few, two cameras that didn't report any species. So an inactive burrow, obviously, that showed no traces of other animals. 1 or 8% that just had one species, wombats in this case. Most of them had 2 species, 3, 4, 5 species in some burrows. A little bit of who's using those burrows. It's rock wallabies, just wombats, a combination of bettongs and rock wallabies, bettongs and wallabies, not so much, rock wallaby and wombats, most of them, and those 3 introduced species, still a respectable 20%. What we're finding is a diurnal niche separation between the species. So here's a resource that's used by different species at different times of the day. I mean, we would expect nocturnal and lizards to be different, but there also seems to be an effect at other times of the days. Rock wallabies didn't seem to be affected; they use it all the time, which actually was also surprising. Then we did some statistical modeling to look at the influence of weather, and that's just taking variables, not only linear but also the quadratic terms, and using a multi-model paradigm, just using it all combinations of those variables and then creating an AIC importance score. And that also shows that the different weather conditions makes wombats and rock wallabies use the burrow entrances difference. And if you take the most important variables and create a model just to see the effects, we see that with increasing temperature, rock wallabies seem to use them less. With increasing rainfall, they seem to use them more, whereas the wombats show strong interaction. So without rain, there's no effect of temperature, and with rain, there seems to be an effect of low use. So maybe there's also a climatic niche separation here of burrows as a resource in the landscape. So, first part of my conclusions. Wombat burrows are used by many other species, so that's something that we have known before, but I think this is a pretty strong documentation of that. There's the niche separation of the time of the day, and there is a possible mutual benefit. I mean, looking at the landscape pattern, when we walked through that island, it looked like we were walking through a parkland. Beautifully cut grass and shrubs. I mean, I would have liked to have my golf course there, golf club there. So maybe, but that's hard to prove without having another controlled experiment and running that for 40 years, so we won't be able to do that. This citation, I think, gives a pretty strong perspective on the use of, on the importance of burrowing animals in arid country. I mean, it's just amazing the effect of wombats on other wildlife. Now, this is the common wombat in Victoria. So, giving another set of conclusion, and that goes a little bit beyond what we are finding, but I think this is evidence that introducing ecosystem engineers, if we are trying to do translocation, will improve conservation outcomes. So here we have our wombat that we could use to actually help us increase our conservation benefits for translocations. Another thing may be of relevance, and that is if we have burrowing species in the landscape, they basically provide air-conditioned space. So, and that in conjunction with what we know, or what's pretty evident from climate research, is that extremes will be more extreme. So the temperature change that we may see, maybe 4 degrees, but what we're also seeing is a higher likelihood of extremes. So here we have the possibility of heat waves. That's, again, is something that we're not looking at, or we can't look at, because it's extreme, rare events. But what happens to arid fauna assemblages if it gets too hot, if the heat threshold actually reaches mortality or increases mortality? So maybe wombat burrows are actually not only refuges, but could also be refugia for the future in terms of climate change. So there's another perspective that this may bring. So back to the wombats and the juvenile sea eagle. So there's actually a reason why they jump into that burrow. And if you look at the time, that's 38:49. Yeah, hovering in there, looking at something, and that's what they're looking at. Yeah, no, he doesn't know what's happening. And then 4 minutes later, they come back out. That's another burrow. Yeah, so here, look at the, there's another burrow entrance, 44. 4 minutes later, the same thing happens at another burrow. Here, wombat, rock wallabies. So somebody is scanning wombat burrows, and another 4 minutes later, it's coming back out. So thank you.